Hey everyone, welcome to week 29. This is going to be our push week. And what we're trying to do during this week is we're going to pick an aspect of our painting and we're going to really exaggerate it, and we're going to find ways to emphasize it. So it's going to be a really good way to kind of hone in on the manner in which our perception is shaped. So let's see how that goes. Go Reds, Premier League champs. Okay, let's get started. Now, for this week, we're going to do something that grows from last week. I think that is the purpose of this bigger exercise, of this Our Painted Lives project, is the fact that we can link things together so they don't seem like disjointed exercises that are just trying to be exciting for excitement's sake. I think that the real value of an exercise like this one is the fact that we can put to test or actually use the things that we think we've learned. All those tools that we've acquired, we actually put them to work. There is no better way to guarantee that we are going to reflect upon those findings than to just say, okay, I think I understood these aspects after making these 5 paintings. Let me see if I can incorporate them to my painting practice and focus in on them, kind of hone in and see if they challenge other things that I think I had learned in the past, or if they open up new doors. And that is the most exciting thing about just making paintings that become sort of fluid. It's not about a single painting. It's about all the reflections that stem from an exercise that comes from painting, from the act of painting, that can lead you somewhere else, where you can find answers or new questions through other acts of painting. So trying to follow and be honest to the nature of the exercise of the Our Painted Lives project, I thought that instead of focusing yet again on something that, quote unquote, we're not supposed to do, I thought we would kind of try to see the same sentiment, but instead of going against something, we're going to try to emphasize something. We're going to try to push something. So this week is going to be called Push. And what are the things that we're going to push? They're going to vary from day to day. I think that we can't kind of blanket statement say, oh, just push more, like if that means something incredibly particular. No, I think that there's a ton of variables that are part of the makeup of the painting, and we can choose where our energy is going to be destined. So there are tons of moments within a single painting that we can try to underline, that we can try and say, yes, this moment holds more gravitas than all these other moments within the painting. We have the ability to determine how our paintings' hierarchies are constructed. Throughout this week, I'm hoping that we can choose one of those aspects and say, I am going to push this in particular. Now, the degree in which we push it, I think that is going to be something incredibly personal. I don't believe that just telling somebody to try and go further, to try and search a little bit harder, to try and reflect a little bit deeper means one single thing. The depth of that reflection can only be determined by the artist. I think that that's one of the most important things that has to be stated during the week, that pushing will not mean the same thing for everyone. Now, having said that, I especially enjoy pushing things. I don't think I do it to the degree I should. There's been many instances where I feel that I can go further, and I do feel I hold myself back. So a lot of this week is also going to be about understanding where that restraint is coming from and seeing why we feel that we can't push through, that we're not supposed to, that it feels kind of weird if we do. Because we have to understand those limits within ourselves. We have to know why we decided that those boundaries were going to be set, because we ultimately also decide that we want to work within very specific parameters. Now, for me, still, one of those parameters, and I think we've talked about that before, is this very formal training that I had in painting. And my formal training was also accompanied by kind of narrative training, in the sense that a painting has to communicate. An image has to communicate something very, very specific. If you really think about it, ambiguity in illustration, it's kind of strange. I mean, it kind of works within certain branches of illustration. Like there's specific kind of editorial illustration that can be far more open and more abstract. I'm not saying that the nature of illustration deters in any way a more abstract way of thinking. But the type of illustration that I wanted to do and that I've always been attracted to is very, very traditional illustration where there is a message that wants to be conveyed and wants to be communicated with clarity. So if you think about it, I had a formal training where many times where I was drawing or when I was painting, the comments that I would hear constantly is that, oh, that is off, or that is too big, or that angle is not as acute. The structure feels off. This feels kind of soft. So it always felt kind of binary. Things were either right or wrong. You were either in the right path where you were being faithful in recreating what you were seeing in nature, or, in terms of illustration, where you were being able to communicate with power the exact message that you wanted to communicate, or you would kind of stray off and you would get lost in the woods and you would have a vague idea of what you wanted to do, but you wouldn't commit. So I kind of understood those two places and I kind of recognized those two places very easily. Part of my growing up as a painter, I feel, and as an artist, if I could put it simply, was feeling comfort in not knowing what I wanted to say, or in my images not really conveying a direct message. I felt that even though I was just blown away and I absolutely adore visual storytelling, like in amazing graphic novels and great comic books, and that is actually part of every great traditional illustration, I also realized that there could be room for not knowing. There could be room for saying, I'm not exactly sure what the message of my painting is. I'm not entirely certain of why this pairing of figures is kind of choreographed in this way. I don't quite understand now, maybe in the future I will, but now why the space has to have this certain character, why the relationship between the figures and the space has to be this certain way. And I did a ton of paintings where I just kind of let myself go and say, well, okay, those questions can be brought up, but they don't have to be answered. They can just be an open door and people can just come in. And it's not like liberating yourself from the responsibility that you have with your image. It's just that I didn't want to set a very kind of narrow road where a single message was the sole objective. So that liberation, that feeling of being kind of unchained and being free to do kind of whatever I wanted with what I wanted to say, also brought up this feeling of, well, if I can say whatever I want and it doesn't have to be something in particular, then I can actually also paint it however I want. This doesn't mean that my choices are not going to mean anything. I think that is something I'm highly conscious of. In fact, I'm probably hyper conscious of all the choices that I make. And I know that because I choose certain manners of representation, that in itself is already a stance on what I believe. I also wanted to see what would happen. What if I push proportions? What if I push the strangeness of the relationship, the awkward relationship between figure and the space that it's inhabiting? That to me was the moment where I realized I can just paint anything. Whenever I speak about I painted whatever I wanted when I was working, with a bunch of galleries, I'm actually referring, yes, to the liberty that was quote unquote given to me by some of these amazing gallery directors to just do whatever I want. But it also speaks about the possibility that I granted myself to say, I'm just going to see what comes out of freely kind of going through these exercises. Now, freely is a weird word because it's probably also contained in the same way as when I say push something. What does it mean to be free when you're painting something? What does it mean to push certain aspects of your painting? I can't answer those questions. What I can say, and if I could try and define it simply, is that when I was going to do a painting, what I would do is I would just kind of scribble something down. And usually almost every single painting was sort of spurred by something that I saw in nature. And I always tried to make mental notes of the things that I was impacted by, the things that I was deeply moved by while I was having that experience of observing directly nature. While I was having that reflection, I always told myself, if you could kind of dissect the way your perception is putting together this image, if you could dissect all these parts, what are those parts that are just really, really moving you? And I didn't really want to question or find the reason of why they were moving me. I kind of let myself say, all I know is that I am being moved by this. And what I'm going to train myself to do is to react to it, to be honest while reacting to it. So instead of just trying to couple the act of painting with a parallel act of trying to understand why I was being moved, I said, I'm not going to question it. I'm just going to react to it. I'm just going to almost like obey it blindly. So what I ended up doing was that if I realized that I perceived something as being longer or broader or warmer, all these characteristics that are tied with the physical way I perceive something, I told myself, I am going to push those things. What did it mean? Well, if I felt that something was longer, then I granted myself the right to say, I'm going to make this really, really long, really elongated. And my next question would be, well, how elongated do you want to make it? Because the answer to that is almost like boundless. What I would do is I would kind of sketch loosely and say, well, I feel it can be this elongated. And then I, immediately would tell myself, what if it was even more elongated? What if it was even thinner when compared to the rest of the image? And sometimes I would just do that and obey that. And sometimes I would just cross the limit. It was very beautiful when you find your limit, when you say, okay, that's a little too much. That's a little bit too much. That's when you go, I can take a few steps back and find that point where I'm either at the verge of making something that is about to collapse and about to look disgustingly ridiculous, or if it feels like there's so much tension to it, this foot on reality, but this also foot where reality is bending itself beyond its limits, that it's going to be gorgeous, that it's going to be an image that feels very strange in that sense. I had never been conscious of those limits. Limits to me, like I said, were constructed on very binary thoughts. So the limits were, if this is right, then I'm within those limits, and right being it is constructed properly, I'm aware of its anatomy, I am trying to be faithful to the way light is hitting the object. I'm being able to model the form properly in a way in which it can describe a three-dimensional volume that occupies space. The relationship between the figures and the space are harmonious. I'm working within a palette that is also congruous, and I'm communicating my intent with clarity. I'm able to narrate the story in a very simple yet direct way, so the message is not lost. Those were my parameters. Those are, very, very easy to identify parameters because you hit them once you're doing something that you could consider wrong. So if you're trying to paint, let's say, a hand, and you step back and you notice that the hand is just not communicating the hand that you wanted to paint, it doesn't feel like the hand that you wanted to paint, it's not faithful to those forms that we're very familiar with, then you just say, I'm wrong and I'm off and I have to work harder and I have to look harder and I have to measure more and I have to control my palette more and I have to check my values more and I have to do all these set of things that are very fundamental about painting. So in that painting practice, as soon as you hit those barriers and you kind of step off the ground in which you're supposed to be working within, you immediately say, no, this is wrong. I have to get back in. This feels weird. I have to get back in. But in the other way, where you were trying to expand your universe, it may feel like you were stepping outside of those boundaries, but it never really felt wrong. It felt like you were perhaps lost because you didn't really understand how to make those variables work. And it feels like you're kind of floating and trying to find your way, but it doesn't feel like somebody's yelling at you from within those parameters, just telling you to come back home. It's like, hey, what are you doing out there? It's dangerous out there. Come back home. No, this felt like, oh my God, this is like unexplored territory. This is something that I'm unaware of, that I am ignorant of, but it doesn't mean that it's wrong. So I think that that's the most important thing about pushing something. You first have to recognize and accept. In my case, it was about accepting those things that I was being moved by. That if I felt something was atmospheric, what does that mean? And how can I make this more atmospheric? If I felt something was slender, how can I make this more slender? If I felt something was just grounded and had a lot of form and weight to it, how can I communicate weight? I had to identify those things first and then push them. And then by identifying, I could say, I kind of know how to interpret those variables through paint. And by knowing how to do that, I can actually know how to emphasize them. I can actually know how to empower them and how to make them feel greater than what they probably are. And that to me was the most important part. And then after that, it was just about the joy of saying, I can actually traverse this really magical place and take it to every single direction that I want. But I have to be aware that there's going to be a point where I don't know where I'm going. And that's the most important thing, that I'm going to be without a compass. It's probably not because it goes beyond the things that you're supposed to do, but that it probably means that you don't have the necessary experience to make that traversal enjoyable. You're just going to be kind of blindly grasping through things and trying to find your way, which is actually something that's very cool, but that can, also take a lot of time and energy. And that could lead to us making paintings, like tons of paintings where we just don't know what the hell we're doing, which can be totally fine. So for this particular painting of push, I did push a lot of those things that I was describing earlier, where if I felt that Dani is super kind of erect and the back of her head, her neck is actually, her spine feels almost like perpendicular to the image plane, I'm going to make it as if it's like stretching her up. It's almost like holding her up. I love that. This simple act of cooking, she made a soup and she's just pouring the soup into a bowl. This very simple, very mundane act of cooking can be interpreted into something else. It's almost like this automated act. It's almost like she's being controlled. As soon as I pushed it upwards, it felt like she was being puppeteered in a way. I love that. I actually love that because making soup is something that we can consider so, everyday life that we don't even question it. But as soon as we start pushing the relationships within the figure and the space and the relationships also within the single figure, then this very simple act becomes more of an artificial ritual of sorts. And when I speak of the painting, in this manner, there is one painter that I feel does that just in an absolutely amazing way. By the way, he has an LCAD talk that I'm going to link in this video. So if you go to the video description, you'll find a link. And I invite everyone to just hear him talk about his paintings because I think he is absolutely brilliant. I think he's technically a ridiculously good painter. But I also feel that everything that I've described about the openness of a painting and how our human nature can be sort of redirected and be presented in so many just almost ridiculous ways, where there is a very soulful act being presented to us, but it's also an act that we have no idea where it's going. We have absolutely no clue about the directions of where this painting is going. We have visual cues that tell us the underlying sort of sentiment behind the painting, the lightness of the painting, or the very threatening quality of the painting. But we don't really understand the fact that there's this huge hole filled with ambiguity. I feel that that's the most remarkable part of Paul Fenniak's paintings. This is a very sort of psychological way of pushing, but there's also these very minute discrepancies within the image. There's these relationships that are just a little off in the way those figures inhabit their environment and the way the environment is affecting the figures. That makes these paintings just absolutely remarkable. So, there's no better way to start this week than to just look at Paul Fenniak's paintings and just enjoy them thoroughly. So that's going to be it for today. I think it's going to be a very cool week because the pushing part of it has so many variables. It can be very subtle, it can be very direct and very exaggerated, and that's going to be up to us to decide. We're going to explore the options that are available to us throughout the week, and hopefully what that does is that it opens up a bunch of doors for all of us. So thank you guys for hanging out. I'll see you tomorrow. Remember, it's Spanish Tuesdays, Martes de Español. So again, it's Spanish class. And if you guys don't know Spanish, just turn the captions on and turn the translation to English. I've actually read a bunch of videos and it's not bad. It's not bad. I mean, I laugh at times because it's it's ridiculous the way it translates a few things, but it also probably has to do with the way I speak. But it's actually pretty good. It gives you a really good idea of what we're talking about. So give that a shot. Thank you guys for hanging out. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.